Welcome again to this webinar, Your Voice Matters. We are talking today about grassroots advocacy during the 119th Congress. This is the Congress that just began in January and will go until the end of 2026. So now is a good time to be talking about this. We've got new leadership, we have new members, and so lots happening and that we need to get your help with to do some advocacy. I really want to point out before we get going that the type of advocacy we're going to talk about today is really where you are advocating on behalf of the service coordinator profession and on behalf of the work that you do every single day. I know you guys are amazing advocates for your residents, making phone calls, making connections to resources. And that is why we know you're going to do such an awesome job at grassroots advocacy with lawmakers. And so keep that in your mind as we're talking today. We're really talking about how important it is for you to advocate on behalf of yourself and the service coordinator profession. So we'll start out with this quote to get you in the right headspace here is that one of the most crucial kinds of intervention is in advocacy. We can think about charities in the context of delivering services, and indeed that is part of their job. But advocacy is also getting governments to step up to the plate. They can also give more voice to those who don't have one. So really important that all of the resources and community connections that you have, all of the nonprofits you work with and that you work for are so important in supporting your residents and the important work that you do every day. But it's really important to make sure that we as a country are supporting the work that you do and the residents that you serve. And that's what today's webinar is all about, is to making sure that this is a priority for the United States and for our members of Congress. This is our policy team at ASK. So I'm Melissa Harris. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the American Association of Service Coordinators. I am based in our Columbus, Ohio offices. Those are our headquarters. And I lead all of our policy work, our strategy at the federal level. And I could absolutely never do all of that work without our wonderful consultants, Bill Benson, Elena Waldrum, and Kendra Keene. I'm lucky to have Elena and Kendra here on today's webinar. They're going to be presenting with me. Fortunately, Bill was unavailable, but together we have a really great team, and I am so fortunate to have them by my side. Bill has 40 years of experience in aging. He was actually a congressional staffer and was a political appointee for the U.S. Administration on Aging, where he was actually the acting assistant secretary for aging. So he is our guru on all things aging, and he really understands the inner workings of Congress and the administration intimately from having spent time working there. And Elena has over 20 years of experience, particularly in housing and affordable supported housing for older adults. So tons of knowledge about how housing programs work, the history of them, that's just really invaluable. And then Kendra has a background in policy research and analysis, especially funding and advocacy. She actually has a master of social work focusing on social change. So she has a lot of the same education that many of you on this call have, and she's put that to work in the public space. So again, just really fortunate to have them. And I hope that you feel very lucky to have this team advocating for you with congressional offices and with the administration. So why is it that ASK has a whole policy team? And why are we here today talking about this? Because advocacy is one of the main focuses of the work that we do here at the American Association of Service Coordinators. And that is because federal government and service coordination are inextricably linked. Without Congress funding service coordination, none of us would be here right now. So every year, Congress determines whether service coordination is funded, how much it's funded, how that funding gets out to you. And once they make those decisions, HUD gets their hands on the money, and then they get to set the timeline for when you get it, the processes that they use to get that funding to you. And then they also set policies and rules about the service coordinator program at HUD. So for example, you have to submit your Standards for Success report every year. You have to keep a resource guide for your residents. You have to have 12 training hours every single year in certain categories. All of those things are policies and rules set by HUD or determined by Congress and then carried out by HUD. So it's really important that we have connections to Congress and to HUD so that they understand what it is that you do every day, what it is that you need to do what you do better, more efficiently and effectively. And then also making sure that if they put policies and rules in place, that they're impacting you positively. They're actually helping you do your job instead of hindering it, right? So it's so important that Ask has this as a pillar to focus on advocacy, because without it, we service coordinators wouldn't have a voice in these types of decisions. And so here are just some ways that Ask is advocating for you all. Of course, working with Congress, going to meetings, requesting legislation, again, the administration. So we have close connections with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, but we also have connections to other federal agencies too, like HHS, and within that, Administration for Community Living, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, all really important because, again, they're kind of the rule makers in the scheme of government. And then we also do a lot of work with partners. This is so important to align yourself with other groups that are interested in the same topics so that you guys are all amplifying the same message. And so we work really closely with a number of groups that are interested in service coordination or have a specific focus on service coordination. So, for example, you might see us working in partnership a lot with Leading Age, National Association for Affordable Housing Managers, NERSC, New England Resident Service Coordinators, lots of great partners who are working toward the same goal as us. And it's important that we're all sharing the same message when we go to Congress or we go to the administration. We're also part of coalitions, and this has been a really big piece of the work that we do. As a matter of fact, Elena and Kendra chair some of the work groups within the Leadership Council of Aging organizations. And these coalitions allow us to better understand similarly situated associations or groups that might care about some of the things we do, but maybe aren't necessarily always focused on housing. So we can also share our message of why housing and service coordination is important to the work they do. For example, on Leadership Council of Aging organization, we have partners from AARP, US Aging, National Association of Social Workers. So although their work is much broader or different than ours, this gives us an opportunity to come together with those groups and talk about why service coordination and housing might fit into what they do and why it's important. And then also research. This has been a huge piece of advocacy for us because if you have third-party research that shows the importance or the impact of the work that you do, when you go to Congress and ask for money or for policy changes, you have some extra leverage, right? They expect us to come into their offices at Congress and say, we want more funding for service coordination. Service coordination is the most important thing in the whole world. They know that we are biased, but working with research institutions like Harvard and Johns Hopkins, we've been able to study the work that you all do, and they put out those studies, and they often make recommendations as part of their studies. And their recommendations have said, service coordinators are making a difference, and we need more of them. We need to support the ones that are already out there. And so if we can go to Congress and say, Harvard says that we need more service coordinators, that's really impactful. So that's been a huge piece of our advocacy over the last few years. And then finally, again, what we're going to be talking about today is grassroots advocacy. So what is that? That is advocacy that you guys do. We are constantly encouraging you all to share your stories, do outreach to your congressional offices, and join us in this work. It is so important that you get involved as well because you understand what's happening on the properties and with your residents better than anyone. I know you guys share those stories with us, and we'll pass those along to offices when we meet with them, but you're their constituents and they really want to hear from you, and they want to hear directly how these programs at the federal level are impacting your work, impacting your residents' lives. So that's the grassroots advocacy is the work that you all do, and it's so important. And so I'll turn over now to Elena, who's going to talk about some of our policy goals and kind of what she's telling congressional offices when she goes to meet with them.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you guys so much for joining us today. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So I am going to talk about the policy priorities a little bit and then talk a little bit about kind of the process. I know I have spoken to you all several times, and so this may be old hat for you all, but we're definitely in a new time in terms of how the administration is working and how Congress is responding. So I think it's really important to think about how much more critical your voice is now as there's all this noise in the background about the things going on. So I just want to say again, please, please, please don't be bashful. You guys are the experts. Use your voice and speak up for the um, for the profession. Is this a little bit better? Can you guys hear me a little bit better now? Yes. Okay. All right. Samantha, hopefully I'm a little bit better. Great. All right. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the policy priorities. So service coordinators, ask represent service coordinators, not just in the HUD Section 202 properties, but also in public housing. These are critical programs, FSS, Ross, and Section 202. So that is the main thing that we do Hill visits on and that we educate people on, members of the Hill. I want to mention that we also do a lot of talking about how important service coordination is as a profession, no matter where it is. Okay. There are people out there who charge hundreds of dollars to be case managers for older adults. So the work that you all are doing is incredibly valuable. We recognize that, and we know the populations that you serve do not have a lot of resources to be able to hire somebody to help them navigate. So again, what you all do is incredibly important. So much of our advocacy is around policy priorities, and I encourage you guys to sit down, take a close look at ASK's new policy priorities because they are incredibly well done. Melissa always does a great job at explaining concisely why service coordination is important and talking about the needs of the programs. We try to strengthen the profession for existing service coordinators. So that is around things like the Expanding Service Coordinators Act, looking at ways to make it easier for you all to do your job, not just in terms of the day-to-day, but also financially, making sure that there's money for training, trying to make sure that there's loan forgiveness where possible. All of that is part of what we advocate on when we talk about the profession. We also talk about rural service coordination a lot. It's an area where ASK has done a lot of work and a lot of uh, issues briefs around and policy proposals around. But the reality is that more and more people are just coming to the realization that older adults and low income families in rural communities are really struggling and that they need assistance to navigate whether it's community based services or job training or whatever it is, that service coordinators are desperately needed in rural communities. So we have made a lot of connections here in DC around that issue. There are multiple organizations that work on it, whether it's through healthcare, housing, whatever it is, rural, we are there talking about service coordination. And so we also educate other organizations about the work that you all do so that they are incorporating that into their policy priorities. The next thing is expanding the availability of affordable housing. We are relatively agnostic on a lot of issues, but the issues that we take a stand on and that we talk about on the Hill are very, very important to the work you guys do. So we are always advocating for more affordable housing. We are, um, like I said, a little bit agnostic on how that comes about, but we talk constantly about the wait list that you guys have at your communities, about the increasing levels of homelessness and the increasing cost of housing. So again, please take a look at the policy priorities brief and share that information with the offices that you're talking to. Next slide, please. Okay, what we're watching closely. So we focus on a couple of areas. Appropriations is always the big one. The money, where's it at? How's it coming through? What parameters are being put around how the funding is going to flow, how that process is going to work. It's basically the same year to year. The steps are the same, but we obviously have new members of Congress coming in every couple of years. And so the dynamics can change a little bit. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. The next thing that we focus on is the HUD staffing and the ongoing contracts. We have been talking about HUD staffing in every Hill visit that we do because we know that members were already struggling with getting funding out, getting responses from offices, all because the staffing has been low at HUD. It is the one agency that has the largest percentage of people eligible for retirement. And so the staffing challenge at HUD is something everybody on the Hill is aware of. Obviously, now at a time where more people are taking buyouts to leave early or at risk of being fired, it's even more of a concern for us. Melissa and the DC team have talked constantly about the need for dedicated staff to focus on the service coordinator programs so that that funding can flow much more quickly and timely. Next, new and existing grant funding disbursements. I would say after appropriations, this is the biggest thing that we talk about. Where's the funding for the existing service coordinator grants? Why is it taking so long to get out year after year? And where are the new grants that were just awarded in January? So we talk about that a lot. We have been very fortunate to have ASK's joint letter with Leading Age that breaks out by state how many service coordinator renewals are pending. And here, we are, that money should be out in January and it's incredibly late. So we talk about that a lot. And then the letter also talks about the Section 202 grants that were awarded that include over 100 new service coordinator grants. Next slide, please. Okay, the appropriations process. Like I said, this is always our top issue. The appropriations process always starts with the president's proposal. So this is an incredibly timely webinar because we have just kicked it off. So we are now starting this formal appropriations process. We have the president's skinny budget out, meaning this is just the outline of what the administration would like to see. There will be a more developed, detailed budget coming out at the end of May. The appropriations bills will start in the House. The House is much larger than the Senate. Most of you probably already know this, but I'll just say it again in case anybody's new here. There are 100 senators and there are 435 members of the House. So the House has a lot more wrangling to do to get the bill moving. I will just mention in this Congress, the 119th Congress, the House is a little bit more chaotic than normal. So just be aware of that. The Senate is where you're going to get a lot of really thoughtful consideration around policy. There are 13 House and Senate Appropriations Committees. The ones that we focus on are transportation, housing, and urban development. We refer to it as THUD all the time. So if you hear me say THUD, that's what I'm talking about. The THUD committee works on putting together the proposals, and that will go eventually to the full appropriations committee. Once the full appropriations committee is ready, they will bring it to the floor and they will vote on it. You have probably heard that there has been a really hard time getting this done. And so what we've ended up with are continuing resolutions where they're not actually able to pass the bills on the floor for the 13 committees. So they end up just doing a continuing resolution based on the previous year. Once there is a bill, if there is a bill that is actually voted on the floor and we have a majority that passes the bill, it will go to conference with the other house. So the House and the Senate will work on separate bills for THUD. Once they are both passed, they will go to conference, they will hash out the differences between the bills, and then they'll send it to the president to sign. Now, reality versus theory. Again, continuing resolutions seem to be the order of the day. My most recent meeting for Ask was this morning, and that Hill staffer in the Senate said that he thought that there was probably a 90% chance that we would end up in another continuing resolution. So even with that, just know we still have to advocate for what we want to see, not just in terms of the numbers, but what we want to see in terms of the policy changes added to that bill. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Melissa to talk about understanding advocacy.
Thanks, Elena. So, and one thing I wanted to add about that appropriations process is that, every year your congressional offices are accepting budget requests. I know some of you have filled them out, especially if you're a member of Coordinator Corps. We have in our email last month a template that you can send to your congressional offices making requests to be included in the budget. And so it's really important that we do that every single year. We reach out to as many offices as we can, and we ask you to do so as well, because there's tens of thousands of requests for the budget that get sent into your offices every single year, and they compile them all. And what we have heard from appropriation staffers is essentially that the top issues or the things that rise to the top are the ones people bring up most. And so you can imagine a lot of the benefits programs that your residents take advantage of probably come up a lot, right? Things like Medicaid, Medicare, nutrition. There's a lot of organizations out there that do advocacy on behalf of those things. But there's a good chance that we are the only ones who are going to put in a budget request saying we need more funding for service coordination. And so that's why it's so important that we all work together on this, because we have to have our issues rise to the top. And the only way we can do that is if they were all using our voices together, right? So, and I don't want you guys ever to feel like we don't care about some of the issues that are important to you or your residents, things like those benefits programs. We certainly do. It's just that we have to stay laser focused on service coordination because, we are the only ones doing it. And we have to make sure that it is a focus and a priority for offices. So again, that's why we need you to help us in this. And so I want to talk a little bit more about understanding advocacy before we jump into how you guys get involved and help us get more funding and do some other things. And the main thing I want you to keep in mind when you think about doing advocacy is that when you are advocating for yourself, when you're promoting the work that you do every day, it's important to remember that you are advocating for your residents when you do that. I say this because for many years at Ask, we have tried to get you guys more involved in this grassroots advocacy. And we've been really successful when we ask you to support a cause that will directly impact your residents, such as last year, we asked you guys to submit letters to protect the Affordable Connectivity Program. And you sent over 1,000 letters to members of Congress telling them why that program was important. Last year, we also asked you guys to tell Congress that we need more money for service coordinators. 30 letters were sent to Congress on that topic. And so you can imagine from that, we realized that what's most important to you, of course, is your residents. And that's great. That's your job. That is why we're all here. You know, that's why this program has been so successful, because you are so deeply caring and your main priority and your main focus is your residents. But I want you to kind of reframe that. You know, if it weren't for you, would your residents have known about the Affordable Connectivity Program? Would they have signed up? Or would it have been too difficult? Would they have given up in the process? You know, remember that a lot of the resources and programs that your residents benefit from, it's only because you exist and you've assisted them in that process. So it's kind of like, you know, the analogy from being on an airplane. I get this all the time. People suggest this to me when I explain to them, you know, what your role should be in advocacy. And it's, you have to put your oxygen mask on first, and then you help the people that are with you. You know, you have to advocate for yourself and promote the work that you do, because where would your residents be? What benefits would they have if it weren't for you, right? So it's so important to remember that I know you guys want to advocate for your residents. So if you're feeling like it's too self-promotional, it's too selfish to advocate for service coordination, just know that you are ultimately advocating for your residents because they need you. Also, you don't have to learn anything new to be an advocate. So if all the stuff that Elena just said about the appropriations process was like very confusing, speaking another language, that's okay if you didn't understand any of it, because you don't necessarily have to know all the intricate details of how the process works, or, you know, where things are at in the budget. You really just have to know what you already know, which is, you know, what you do every day. You know the impact you have. You know what your residents' needs are. You know what your needs are. And really, those are the things that we want you to share with your congressional offices and any other elected officials, is just your story, you know, who you are, what you do, and how you help people. And then finally, your voice matters. You know, that's the topic of this presentation for a reason. As Elena said, you know, things right now are difficult on the Hill, right? There's a lot of issues where there's a lot of controversy, and your members of Congress have made up their minds on those issues, and they wouldn't change no matter how many times you called them. That is true. But when it comes to advocating for service coordination, that is not the case. It is not a partisan issue. We have had support on both sides of the aisle for service coordination. We have never spoken to a congressional office that's been in opposition to service coordination. And in reality, most offices have never even heard of a service coordinator. They don't know who you are, they don't know what you do. And so, really, this is all about just mostly educating your congressional staff about who you are and why it's important. You know, you can't have a champion if they don't even know that you exist out there. So it's all about education. And then once you do educate people, they're always really grateful and they love this program. So don't ever feel intimidated by the political climate right now when it comes to service coordination. People want to hear from you. They want to learn about this. And it's important that you specifically get involved because you are key in advocacy. Something you notice, this is a study that they did, or a survey of Hill staff from a couple of years ago. And what they said was that for them, the most effective forms of advocacy with a lot or some influence is in-person visits from constituents and contact from constituents that represent other constituents. So those are the top two. And that second one is you. You as a service coordinator typically represent, you know, 100 or more other constituents. You have this knowledge about the needs of people in your community and about how federal benefits programs work that most Americans just don't have. And so that makes you a really great resource for these congressional offices. You know, they want to understand large groups of people in their communities, and they really want to understand how things are working, whether they're working, if they're not working. And you have all that information. So that makes you a really valuable constituent in their eyes. So they really want to hear from you. And then again, in-person visits, that's really important. So that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. Kendra's going to give you some tips for setting up some in-person visits with your congressional staffers, making those personal connections with them, especially like through phone calls and emails, because we're hearing that that is what is valuable to them. One of those top stats is 87% of Hill staff thought that technology made it easier for constituents to be involved in public policy, which is wonderful. We want you to still send our form letters in our action center, but because technology has made connections to Hill staff so much easier, they start to weight more those interactions that show that someone's really invested in their advocacy, right? It's easy to push a button and send a letter from our action center to congressional offices, and they know that. But they know that it gets progressively harder from there. So if you're someone who makes a phone call, they're like, this person must care a little bit more than somebody who would just push a button on their phone. But then to actually reach out and try to set up a meeting with them, they know that you're serious and they're going to take you seriously too. So before we get into some of those ideas as to how you can do some outreach and start doing some advocacy, I want to just kind of give you a visual of your role in advocacy and how that falls into the spectrum of what Ask is doing that we talked about and what some of the things your residents might be able to do. And I think it's important to see this because, as I mentioned, you guys are really key constituents. You hold a power that most other people in your communities don't have. And it really is your knowledge base and your access to many constituents, right? And so because of that, your responsibility is a little bit higher than just the average person out in the world who would be contacting their congressional offices. So, at Ask, of course, we talked already, we promote those high-level experiences that you guys share with us through congressional visits, by talking with HUD. We're building those nationwide partnerships, and we're encouraging you guys to get involved in advocacy. But something that you can do is that you can promote the community and state impact of service coordinators through those personal connections with congressional staff. And Kendra's going to mention later that you guys all have congressional staff in your districts, in your states. They have offices and staff who live right near you. We're in DC, but it's really important for you to build connections with those local staff because they live in your community and they care more than anybody about the work that you do and the programs that you're connecting people to. You can also build local and state partnerships with groups like even some of the nationwide partnerships I mentioned. You can work with the state or local versions of those. It's really important to think local too, not just at the federal level when we talk about advocacy. And then we also have opportunities for you to encourage your residents to be involved, especially, if they're concerned about any issues, you want to give them opportunities to be able to contact their congressional offices or get involved. And something under the property staff section that I'll mention is that I have property staff up there instead of service coordinator, just because we know that at some companies there are whole departments doing advocacy work. So before you start getting involved in some of this, I encourage you to reach out to your supervisor or other leadership at your organization to see if anybody's actually already making some of these connections with congressional offices. And they might already be doing this, and you can join in on that work, or you can encourage them to get involved with you. Actually, some of the national associations that we work with, or national housing providers, do have policy staff who go to the Hill, but oftentimes they are not talking about service coordination. They're talking about affordable housing or other funding streams that impact their organization. And so it would be good for you to start working with maybe the policy team at your organization to make sure that they're elevating service coordination. And then one other thing about the work that you guys can do is that as a nonprofit, as many of you likely work at a nonprofit, you are able to do congressional outreach and advocacy. We at Ask are not lobbyists, and so neither are you, right? We do education. It really is about mostly telling people what you do every day and why it's important. We are not lobbying. So you are allowed to do this if that ever comes up. And then finally, so once you encourage those residents to get involved in some advocacy, something they can do is share their stories by calling and writing elected officials and participating in local meetings and events. And so those are impactful things, but on a smaller scale, you can also participate in that type of advocacy as well. But if you're able to, we really want you to take that extra step and go under this like middle box of doing some of those more concentrated efforts. But we'll talk about both today, calling and trying to set up some in-person meetings.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about effective advocacy because I think that this is really important. Like I said, there's a lot of noise right now going on. And so I really want you guys in your education of Hill staff, members, local elected officials, I want you to really be laser focused on a couple of key points and do not let the background noise um, take you off your path. Okay. So, two things really important for effective advocacy: repetition and clarity. Okay. Repetition and clarity. So, Melissa said, don't get bogged down in the, kind of the minutia of the process. I agree 100%. Um, do not let all of that stuff distract you from what your message is and how you're saying it as clearly and concisely as possible. So, sharing stories and data is really important. We've all talked about elevator speeches a million times. You should have that. I serve X number of residents. Um, this is the average age at my property. Here are the 2 or 3 biggest issues that we're struggling with: food security, uh, transportation. Whatever those things are, have them be clear, be concise. You do not need flowery, detailed, verbose language. Be repetitive and be to the point. Every member or every elected official who meets with you should know exactly what your issues are, and they should all have heard the same thing. Okay. Um, so that's one thing. Um, I, again, this all comes down to communication because that's the real big strength that you guys are bringing to this. Your experience, your communication, and you're telling them what you need, right? So, um, sharing stories, sharing data, um, and then offering solutions, right? One of the things that we hear all the time from members is, okay, what can we do? What can we do? What would help? And so, thank all of you that reach out to Melissa and talk about the challenges that you're facing because she comes up with really clear, concise solutions for us to advocate on. And that is incredibly helpful. We're able to talk about what the problem is and how what we're recommending fixes that problem. Anyone who's ever been in a Hill visit with me will hear the same exact points, right? Um, so, so that's one thing. I want to say this, and this may be hard for some folks, but I really want you to practice. Stand in front of the mirror and practice. Do not hedge. Do not capitulate in advance on what you're asking for. Okay. Nothing is more frustrating than when we go into meetings with folks and they say, well, we know that there's a lot of things going on and, we serve low income people. No, no, no. I'm a service coordinator. Here are the people I serve. We need more service coordinators. We need service coordinators to be making a reasonable salary so that we can keep doing the important work that we do. Other people, they're going to be listening to you and juggling all the other priorities in their head. That is not your job. Your job is to educate them on service coordination and the value. Educate residents and their families. Okay. that is really, really important in terms of identifying other champions. Not everybody is going to be a champion. Not everybody has the capacity, the understanding, the drive. But there are people out there that if they know that something's an issue, they'll say, "Oh, I didn't realize that, this program doesn't get enough funding. Is there anyone else I could talk to?" So the question somebody just asked is, should you bring up things that are only in someone's purview? And if you were in the last session that I did for Ask, you knew that one thing that we talked about is identifying what someone can do for you, what that elected official or that community member has control over. So you should focus on that when you're talking about the solutions. Like then you're really looking at what their purview is. But your basic elevator speech should be the same no matter what. Everybody should understand why you are incredibly valuable to this community. Okay. And that's only, 2 or 3 sentences. And then you can say to them specifically, I know that your organization provides a grant for, you know, community services, and the residents in my building really need X, right? So that's when you kind of look at the purview. But this session is really focused on service coordinators and advocating for this program specifically. Okay. And so you are talking to people that make decisions about whether or not a service coordination program continues and whether or not it's funded adequately. So those are the people that we are talking about, you using your voice to educate. Okay. So they're going to be members of Congress. They may be local elected officials. Um, but yeah, that's what's really key. Funding, um, and the broadening of the profession. So make local connections. One of the reasons that members right now are uh, really concerned about the funding proposals that are out there is because they're hearing from people in their district, in their state, and they're hearing from the local elected officials, right? So for housing, one of the things that the administration proposed was to, you know, get the state to share part of the cost. The governors, the mayors, the local elected officials are thinking like, we don't have the capacity to do that. Our budgets are already tight, and you want to move more healthcare dollars, more housing dollars to our responsibility. That doesn't work. So again, make those local connections and talk about it. Exactly. You do not want to wait until you're on the cutting block. You want to be one of the first people out of the gate. And I will give you a great example of what this looks like in Congress. There are 12 members of Congress who support the president in most of what he proposes. But they got together and they wrote a letter to say, hey, we are not going to support any type of action that cuts a significant amount of money from Medicaid. Okay. These are folks who are saying, we got bright lines out here. All right. And this is what's important in our district or our state. So just know that that's really, really key. Ongoing communication. I know we're running a little bit behind. I want to make sure we get to all the slides, but ongoing communication is key. Identify your members of Congress, make sure you know what they look like in case you ever run into them in the district, and make sure that you're following them on social media so that you know what they're talking about. And if they're not talking about housing and service coordination, you have more work ahead of you to educate their offices on why that's important. Okay. So I will stop there and we will move it over to Kendra. Thank you.
Great. So now we're going to move into some tips on actually doing this. What do you do out there in the wild in the public? One of the first things, one of the easiest probably to do is calling congressional offices. So you can everybody has, you have your House of Representatives member and then 2 senators. So we really encourage you to call all three. You can find their phone numbers. Usually they're pretty easy to find on the website. Or there's also the Congressional Switchboard, can also help put you in contact, or frankly, just Google sometimes. Um, and then not only do you have the DC office, all of them also have regional offices, and they might have more than one regional office, depending on who it is. So you not only can call the DC office, you can also call the regional offices, and they share that information with the DC office as well. We'll also give some other thoughts on calling the regional offices later. Um, there's no limit to how often you can call. You can call every day if you want to. And you can mention multiple topics. As Melissa mentioned, we really want to also have that clear message that um, the service coordinators need funding, that funding needs to go out um, to keep you all in business. And it doesn't have to be in depth, doesn't have to be a treatise. It can be just a few sentences like that. I'll say when you call, you are most likely to get an intern or like a receptionist. That is not an issue. They will take down your message, and your message is still important. And as Melissa was saying with those appropriation requests, similarly with contacting the office, the more folks we have calling in on service coordinators, the higher, that's going to get an importance, the higher priority level that is. And then we really encourage you to look into personal meetings and property visits. Congress is going to be going on recess in a few weeks, and recess doesn't mean they stop working. Recess means, they're home in the district, talking to you, talking to residents. So what you can do is by going back to to their website, you can find those regional offices, um, and find their phone number. And so you probably have a regional office close to your property. You can call them and ask for contact information for who might cover housing programs, um, schedulers, anyone who might be helpful. You can also email, and so you can email that congressional staff member in charge of housing issues. Melissa has a great, really simple template. I think we might put that link in the chat, but there is an easy template you can use to contact those folks. I really do encourage you to call or email to follow up. And this goes for any DC connections as well, because there are busy times, as you might expect. So we want to make sure that you're on their radar screen. And you can also do that to invite folks to your property, if you have events going on or to meet your residents. It's always great to do. So, next slide. So there is a pretty easy formula. This can really apply to calls, emails, visits, etc. So you want to start with who you are, why you're important, like basically why you're important to them. So I might say, hi, I'm Kendra. I work at a Ask property in Virginia. I'm, your constituent, Senator Warner. What you care about. This is where you bring in what Elena and Melissa talked about. I'm here to talk to you about service coordinator funding. why it's important, why obviously the important work you do. And we really, use your own words and phrases. You don't have to get fancy. And really consider mixing in, stories or data, building that personal connection. Well, we've had some congressional meetings where we talk to staff and they realize, oh, my relative, is in a property with a service coordinator. Um, that education. And then, of course, the clear call to action. You can go back to asks priorities. You can give them a link to asks priorities. And of course, always thank folks and follow up with a thank you. I know so next slide. So I mentioned you probably want to include some data and stories. These are just a lot of the data we include in our meetings. How many residents you serve, how many might be in Medicare or Medicaid, some of those basic demographics. Down at the bottom, you see how many times you support them with basic needs, like telling them what do you do as a service coordinator? Why are you important to the property? And also conveying how is your position funded? Why is this funding important to you? What would the impact be if you weren't there? You are essential. So, and Melissa has some great resources on the webpage that you can see some examples of how she's used this data. So next slide. Just as an example, I'm a service coordinator at Ask Towers in, your district. We have 100 older adult residents that rely on HUD housing, SNAP, public transportation. I have helped them connect with these programs. I help them every day to meet their basic needs, and this helps them continue living independently. And then I would go into that, call to action, answer questions. Um, and then of course, once you make the connection, we want you to keep up that connection. Make sure you're a source for resources, for information. Melissa mentioned the appropriations requests earlier. So take the opportunity to submit that. And one of the things is considering a monthly plan for regular context. Make sure you're sharing good news. Did you have a great story in the local paper? Those local contexts are really important. Share anything Asks puts out. Invite folks to events. I'll also say the Congress and their offices are there for constituent help. So if you're having issues, getting in contact with the VA, please consider going to them to ask for help with federal benefits. And also let them know, are there things residents really need that, there just aren't the resources for? I think there are a couple questions. Yeah. I'll turn it over to Melissa for a resources slide.
Before Melissa talks,
Mhm.
because I know we're almost at time, I just want to say one of the easiest things you can do is put this on your calendar to reach out to the offices. So that's one important thing that you can do. Make sure it just reoccurs, whatever, the second Monday of every month. And you go and you check out their social media, you see what they're talking about, you see that they're going to be in the district, shoot their local office an email and say, hey, I understand that Senator so and so is going to be in the district. If you're interested in learning more about service coordination, we'd welcome him or her to come by. So, just make it a regular thing. You don't want to get bogged down in end up cyber stalking your member of Congress, you have other things that you guys have to do. But put it on your calendar so that it's something that you at least get in the habit of doing once a month, once every other week or whatever. Okay. All right. Turn it over to Melissa for Ask Resources. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one question that I saw in the chat. I serve non-English speaking older adults. Yeah. So, this is a really good question. How should you talk about what you do to different offices? I will tell you that I tailor my message to the office that I'm meeting with, right? So, if I'm meeting with an office that may not be amenable to public funding for programs, I talk about how much more it would cost to have somebody in a skilled nursing facility, right? How housing and services, thanks to having a service coordinator, can actually save taxpayer dollars. So I would say tailor your message to whoever it is that you're talking to. Okay.
That's a very good point. And if you're looking for anything to help you in your meetings, like, to make those points that Elena just talked about, or if you're looking for something to send your office, if you want to keep in touch with them every month, we have a ton of resources on our website. This is actually our policy section of our website. When you go to servicecoordinator.org, if you click on public policy on that tab, it's going to bring you to this. There's fact sheets, case studies, and reports there. Those are going to be some great resources for you guys you can link them if you're sending an email to your congressional staff. You can print them out and bring them in person if you're going to be meeting with someone. You don't have to reinvent anything or make your own items. You can just take these and run with them. We also have an advocacy resources section. That's where you're going to find the links to those template letters that Kendra talked about. There's an advocacy advice section. That's where you're going to find advice on what to do when a congressional staff wants to visit your property, how to host them. So lots of good stuff there. Some other ways you can get involved. We have Ask Action Alerts. There's an action center on the bottom right side of that page. Nina put in the chat a link to our current action alert, which is a petition for more funding for service coordinators. So please sign that if you haven't already. We're going to share that with your congressional offices when we go to visits. We also have our coordinator core, which if you're not already a member, we encourage you again to join. But lots of good resources on there. We encourage you to take a look. And if you're planning to attend a National Service Coordinator Conference this year, we are going to have our Hill visits. So if you want to get front and center with your congressional staffers and along with other service coordinators, you can join us on the Hill after this year's Service Coordinator Conference. So please consider that as well. So I'll just leave you with this before we end for the day. They always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself. So I'm glad that you all are here. Let's get together and start making some change. If you ever have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. We love hearing from you. We love helping with advocacy and coming up with ideas. So please contact us anytime. Thank you so much for being here.